Jackie, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jackie Bonomo, president of PennFuture, a statewide environmental advocacy and policy organization working on clean air, clean water, a healthy climate, and clean energy. And on behalf of PennFuture and our co-sponsor, Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today and remind you that this is recorded, and so it'll be available at a future time if you'd like to have another look at it. So the last 2 weeks, the world watched as leaders of nations and activists, business and elected officials and others came together in Glasgow for the Conference of Partners, or COP, the 26th United Nations Climate Summit, to plead their cases. The summit was unlike any other before. The imperative for action never more urgent, the science never clearer, the solutions never so evident, the stakeholders so many, the impacts never so widespread, and the need of those places in the world suffering most never so great. As I reflected daily on the news reports from COP26, so many of the sentiments expressed by attendees and talking heads were really resonant with me. The anger and the frustration, the intense desire for action and justice, the outrage over the influence of the fossil fuel industry, and above all, the clinging to hope. Resonant with me because the realities of COP26 is what PennFuture and our partners experience almost daily as we fight for the cause of climate solutions in the very unique state of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, where we've been mining for coal since just 14 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed, where in 1859, petroleum first became an American industry at a place called Oil Creek in northwestern Pennsylvania, and where just 20 years later, gas was first extracted from shallow wells in Murraysville near Pittsburgh, to Pennsylvania present day, where despite over 20 years of fossil fuels insults to our environment and communities, and despite a climate emergency, in 2004, Pennsylvania began fracking for gas and now is the second largest producer of frack gas in the United States. So when it comes to climate action, Pennsylvania is also a pretty tough nut to crack. But fossil fuels' legacy of harm to our people, land, water, and climate has also made an indelible mark on some people here and has helped to shape some truly outstanding climate leaders here in Pennsylvania. And so we are really fortunate to have several of those climate leaders and Pennsylvanians with us for today's event. Individuals whose leadership on climate change is so noteworthy that they attended the climate proceedings in Glasgow, and they're here to share their reflections on the summit and its very, very complex outcomes. From Kim Martinez, whose work serves young people and future climate leaders, to climate communicator and scientist extraordinaire and PennFuture board member, Dr. Michael Mann, to United States Congressman Brendan Boyle, hailing from Philadelphia, who attended COP26 as part of Speaker Nancy Pelosi's delegation, to Pittsburgh Mayor Bill Peduto, who, yes, can make lucid and compelling cases for economic development and jobs in sustainable sectors to leverage Western Pennsylvania's tremendous workforce and knowledge institutions, but with whom Donald Trump just couldn't resist picking a fight over climate. We're in for some really great insights. Our facilitator for the hour is PennFuture board member Steve McCarter. After a long and distinguished career in teaching at the high school and college levels and other scholarship, Steve was elected to the Pennsylvania General Assembly, representing the Cheltenham area. He was an ally of PennFuture's on a great many issues, but he really distinguished himself when he created the Pennsylvania Legislative Climate Caucus and served as its chairman and co-chairman from 2016 to 2020. Under Steve's leadership, the Climate Caucus's 70 members were influential in encouraging Governor Tom Wolf to join the United States Climate Alliance and to begin the process of joining the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, a climate priority for our organization and really crucial to Pennsylvania contributing something to climate solutions. No longer a legislator, Steve is a great board member for both PennFuture and Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania, and really encouraging of our staff team. And we thank him for helping us out today. So over to you, Steve. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jackie, and thank you for your very kind introduction and for all you do to make PennFuture the preeminent environmental organization that it is today in Pennsylvania. It's my pleasure to serve as moderator today, and we all know that with each passing day, dealing with climate change becomes more urgent. The COP26 conference having just concluded, we're fortunate today to have, as Jackie said, four very, very great climate champions to help us look at what happened at COP and to try to gauge as to where we go from here. And so with that, I want to try to first, hopefully, Brendan Boyle, Brendan, are you on now? I guess maybe Brendan isn't quite here with us.
I am here, Steve.
There he is. Okay. Brendan, again, let me introduce you first then as our first speaker today. Brendan represents the 2nd Congressional District in Philadelphia. He was first elected to Congress in 2014 after serving 3 terms in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. And Congressman Boyle now serves on the powerful House Ways and Means Committee, having also served as on the Senate or the House Foreign Relations Committee for several years. And again, was a key member of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's delegation to the COP conference. So welcome, Brendan, and please share with us what you observed at the meeting and what you feel was or was not accomplished.
Yeah, well, it's great. It's great to be with you and working with you, Steve, in this capacity. We had such a great working relationship and personal friendship in the state legislature, including, of course, as you know, co-locating our offices then when I was in Congress and represented that part of Montgomery County. We made pretty good bookends. Now, in terms of COP26, it was quite inspiring to be there and to see and interact with people from all over the world who get it and had a real sense of urgency. We were there for 4 days. When I say we, the speaker and the members of Congress were part of this, the official delegation. And what I'd say is that of all the kind of, we met with the UN Secretary General, we met with of course, our climate czar, John Kerry. We met with the president of COP26, countless parliamentarians, NCOs, both international, domestic, et cetera. But of all the meetings, I was really struck by something John Kerry said, because he's been attending a ton of the previous 25 COP summits. And he said this was the one that had by far the biggest sense of urgency, that people really do get it and understand that the clock is ticking. And that we don't have forever to solve this problem. Now, in terms of what was achieved there, I would say let's not give it short shrift. It is historic. What was achieved there was important, but there's still work that clearly needs to be done. On some of the more significant developments, I think the global methane pledge was significant. I mean, the countries that committed to that make up about 70% of worldwide methane emissions. This was something that was first proposed by the US as well as the EU. Of course, China, Russia, and India did not sign that specific pledge. Perhaps we'll talk a little bit more later about the side agreement that was reached between the US and China, which I do think is significant. Of course, it's not just a matter of pledges, it's what you're going to do to follow up on them. And so the fact that I was yesterday at the signing ceremony of the White House for the infrastructure bill, and this week we will pass, I can now say pretty confidently, we will pass out of the House the Build Back Better Act, which, as you may know, Steve, is $555 billion to address climate change, climate resiliency, accelerate our transition to clean energy. The combination of those two things, COP26 combined with the actions that we are taking here in Congress, do leave me more optimistic than when this month began.
Well, thank you for that, Brendan. And it's, fascinating. I know that, so much of the time sometimes can be taken up with meetings that you kind of miss the gist of, the overall feeling. So I appreciate your taking the time to tell us a little bit about that as well. I think one of the things you mentioned is one of the accomplishments here was that side agreement with between the United States and China. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that and what you think that can hold for the future?
Yeah, I'd say, it was a little bit of a pleasant surprise. This is my characterization, but I would say a pleasant surprise. The joint declaration said China would begin phasing out, so not phase out, but begin phasing out its coal consumption during the 5 years from 2026 to 2030, and would cut emissions of, the enormously powerful greenhouse gas methane. I think methane is 80 times more destructive than carbon dioxide. So when I say powerful, it's almost understating it. Now, look, let's be clear. China, 1.3 billion people, about 20% of the world's population, but China consumes more than 50%, more than one half of coal, worldwide coal. So getting them on board with an agreement, even though they weren't there, I think is significant. Now, I'll read a quote here that I just in preparing for this that I think can be instructive. This is the EU climate policy chief, Franz Timmermans. He said, quote, "It's very encouraging to see those countries that were at odds in so many areas have found common ground on what is the biggest challenge humanity faces today. And it certainly helps us here at COP to come to an agreement." So I think that side agreement with China was not just significant in terms of our bilateral relationship with China, but it was also significant in terms of reaching the unanimous agreement that was reached at COP26. So those would really be I think the main points. And then if I didn't mention it earlier, the fact that China did agree to develop, they didn't say what it would be, but they did agree for the first time ever to develop an ambitious plan to cut methane emissions. That's a significant step.
And a follow-up to that then would be that China also pledged to come in with specific goals in terms of emissions reductions coming up for the next conference as well.
Yeah, COP27.
Yeah, which I think will be critically important as well as we move forward. A second area, and again, you alluded to this, obviously, with China not pledging to, eliminate coal. India and Pakistan, I think, also were not signatories in a sense, if you want to think of it that way, of moving in that direction. But the final statement said reduction in use of coal. Again, do you see them as can we say the roadblock in a sense of moving forward even for COP27 as we go on here? Or do we see that maybe we have an opportunity here now with China's agreement and this bilateral agreement to be able to move them into the corner, if you will, of moving forward on reduction and elimination of coal in the next agreement?
Yeah, so it was at the last minute, India's climate negotiator who proposed the change from phase out to phase down, and with respect to unabated coal as well as fossil fuel subsidies. Now, climate czar, I forget what we're calling him these, the climate envoy or secretary or climate czar, whatever title he uses, John Kerry defended this, basically saying, look, it might be a bit watered down, but we weren't going to have an agreement without it. So that's essentially the choice that we faced at COP26. I think as we look toward COP27 in Egypt, there's no question in my mind that more than any other country, India tends to be the biggest holdout, and they're the ones that have to be brought or dragged along more than China. I mean, more than any other country. I've been to India when I was on the Foreign Affairs Committee, traveled there. Obviously, I won't get into, the change really in Indian politics and the rise of Hindu nationalism. But I would say that it is worth keeping in mind that India economically is still just in a very different place than China, and that is one of the considerations as we move forward in attempting to get us on a much better path by, forget 2050, by 2030.
Well, again, I want to thank you for, kind of clarifying that. And again, I think we have a little bit of breaking news here that you say that the Build Back Better bill, you're now very confident is going to pass by the end of this week. And how do you see that as influencing, in a sense, our ability to be able to meet our goals coming up for what we've set now forward and as part of COP?
Yeah, Steve, being a veteran former legislator, picked up on that. That is breaking news, because that is not something that is in the public right now. There's I think where things stand officially is, will we pass it? Will we not pass it this week? In talking to some folks, I'll just put it that way, I would now say I am quite confident that we will pass it this week. It might drift into Saturday. But nonetheless, I am quite confident we will pass it this week. It will then go over to the Senate, in which, unfortunately, it will probably change, and from my perspective, not for the better. That said, though, I mean, this is really remarkable. Remember, the single biggest piece of this, whether it's 1.5 trillion or 1.75 trillion, the biggest single piece by far is the $555 billion that have to do with climate. And so just to highlight some of the specific things that are in there, we're talking about the largest single investment in our clean economy, our clean energy economy in history: buildings, transportation, industry, electricity, agriculture, as well as climate smart practices across lands and waters. The framework will set the United States on course to meet its climate targets, achieving an approximately 52% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions below 2005 levels by 2030, and doing so in a way that grows jobs and grows the economy. And it's not just me saying that. Moody's Analytics, not exactly known as a bleeding heart lefty type of group, they have talked about the millions of jobs on average that will be created every single year by doing this. We're talking about driving substantial consumer rebates and tax credits to reduce the costs for working families to shift to clean energy. The rebate on electric vehicles is just quite remarkable, and that's just one specific example. We're talking about the Clean Energy and Sustainability Accelerator that will invest in projects around the country that ensured 40% of the benefits of the investment will go to disadvantaged communities. That's part of the President's Justice 40 initiative. So those are, one of the challenges with doing all of this through reconciliation is that we're actually doing a lot of popular things that have to be put into one bill, which actually makes it more of a challenge messaging, because there's just so much good stuff that's in there in a normal legislative process that wouldn't have to worry about the filibuster. This probably would be broken up into a dozen different bills.
Okay, those are great things. If we can get those accomplished, and along with obviously solar credits and others that
Yes.
give the opportunity for people to be able to not only put solar panels on their houses, but also to buy into credits in different ways also, and along with EV, electric vehicles, it'll be a great step forward. Again, I know you have to run, unfortunately, to another event here, so we want to thank you very, very much for your participation today. Again, thank you for being part of that delegation, and thank you for sharing your views with us. And again, make sure that gets passed by Saturday so we can get moving forward.
I'm on. Steve has me on the clock. My wife also wants to make sure it is passed.
I'm sure she does.
Since she's at home watching our 7-year-old daughter, Abby. So thank you, Steve, and thank you to everyone at PennFuture for what you do.
Thank you very, very much for being with us today. We're also fortunate to have, one of the preeminent climatologists and preeminent climate change experts on the board of PennFuture, and that being Dr. Michael Mann. And Dr. Mann wanted very much to be able to be with us today, but unfortunately, he takes his teaching very, very seriously at Penn State. And so he's with his students today, but he did send us a message that we wanted to make sure it gets played today of his reactions. He has been on television, I think most of us are aware, over the past 2 weeks during the COP conference, almost continuously, whether on cable news, the BBC, and the networks. We've seen Michael quite a lot, but again, his commentary on what took place at COP is critical, I think, for all of us to be aware of. So again, Jared, if we could, can we get that up here, or Travis, rather?
Well, it's great to speak to you. I want to thank all of the PennFuture supporters who are participating in this event. It's a very important time. If you care about the defining challenge of our time, the climate crisis, this is our moment. PennFuture, I'm proud to be a supporter and a board member of PennFuture because of all of the important work that they've done here in the state of Pennsylvania, trying to galvanize support for meaningful climate action. And as I said, this is a critical moment. We are on the heels of a very important international climate summit that just finished the other day, the COP26 United Nations Climate Summit in Glasgow. And this was largely seen as the last opportunity to make binding commitments for the countries of the world, to make binding commitments that will get us on a path to limiting warming below truly dangerous levels, typically defined as 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's about 3 degrees Fahrenheit warming of the planet relative to the pre-industrial. And we're most of the way there. So in order to accomplish that, the task before us is monumental. We've got to bring carbon emissions down by 50% within this decade. We have to bring them down here in Pennsylvania, here in the United States, and of course, the entire planet. We do have now a president, an administration that has prioritized climate action. The United States has made a very bold pledge to lower carbon emissions by 50%, consistent with the larger task that we have to commit to as a civilization. And there are some obstacles still in the way to the United States achieving that, being able to satisfy that pledge. We need legislation to pass Congress that codifies the climate provisions of the Biden climate plan, including in particular those provisions that will incentivize renewable energy, that will reduce support, reduce subsidies, for example, for fossil fuel energy, and which will require utilities to provide a larger and larger share of their electricity from renewable sources, what's known as a clean
Travis, can we get that back up there?
Trying to right now.
Okay, thanks.
We've got a network error. Sorry about that. It's on the Zoom end.
Aha. Okay, well, what would a Zoom broadcast be without at least one error somewhere in here? So let's, okay, we'll kind of leave it at that, I guess, at this point, and to thank Michael very, very much for doing that, unless we can get that back up there quickly.
a clean power or a clean energy portfolio standard. So that's what the United States has to do. In Glasgow, we were able to come to the table. The United States, through the executive actions that the president has taken, has demonstrated it is serious. And that really brought China to the negotiating table. And sort of the turning point at COP26, it was sort of off to a bad start. The optics weren't great. A lot of climate activists were very frustrated at what was happening, at the lack of progress, at the lack of meaningful commitments, for example, to phase out coal, to remove fossil fuel subsidies, to provide support to developing countries to develop their energy infrastructure in a clean, renewable manner. But about 2/3 the way through the 2-week summit, the United States and China, in a surprise agreement, made this very important pledge to work together to prioritize climate action and to phase down coal. Now, the language, there has been some back and forth about the language of phasing out versus phasing down, but it was a commitment on the part of China, which is the world's largest carbon polluter today. The United States is the world's largest legacy climate polluter. We've added more climate pollution to the atmosphere thus far, but right now, China is producing more carbon pollution. So it was really important that these two countries came together and made meaningful commitments, and they did. And that, in the end, allowed the COP26 statement, the official agreement at the close of COP26, included that language to phase down coal. So we didn't get quite as much as many of us hoped for, but we probably got what we needed. We needed to stay in the game. We needed for 1.5, limiting warming to 1.5 Celsius, 3 degrees Fahrenheit to still be a possibility. And it still is. In fact, folks who have crunched the numbers have shown that based on the commitments that were made in Glasgow, the projected warming for the first time is now starting to fall below 2 degrees Celsius. That's not enough. We've got to get it below 1.5 Celsius. There's a whole lot more work to be done, but that goal still remains a possibility now. And what's essential now is that we make sure that the United States is able to make good on its commitments. And first and foremost, that means putting pressure on our politicians to pass this Build Back Better reconciliation package in Congress that will codify the commitments of the Biden pledge and allow us to make good on our commitments, and in so doing, make sure that other important actors are willing to make good on their commitments as well. And so that's going to take work on our part, working with organizations, supporting organizations like PennFuture that are working to make sure that our policymakers engage in actions on our behalf rather than too often simply acting as rubber stamps for polluters. So we need to use our voices. We need to support groups like PennFuture. This is our moment. Let's make it happen.
Well, again, let me thank Michael very much for his advocacy.
It's great.
I want to thank Michael very much for his advocacy. His messaging has been spot on. I think it's really critical that we keep a hopeful tone out of COP. And it would be very easy to be negative, I think, out of some of the things that didn't get accomplished. But I think, as Michael has suggested in his message, that, again, there are a lot of hopeful signs going forward. So again, thank him. I thank Michael very, very much for his participation today. And again, he has been so invaluable for helping all of the PennFuture family. Next with us is Kim Martinez, National Wildlife Federation Vice President of Education and Engagement, responsible for the development and delivery of educational programming for both pre-K to 12 and higher education. Ms. Martinez was an attendee at the Glasgow meeting and joins us today to give her view of the conference's outcomes. And again, welcome, Kim, and we thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. And I'll go ahead and start by saying I'm not a policy expert, but I work with a team of wonderful policy experts that were in the negotiating rooms and in the blue zone for the full 2 weeks, really negotiating around Article 6 and around some of the supply chains related to forestry. And so I was able to compile some of their reflections as well in this presentation. Really what I was there to do was to look at youth engagement and to see how education plays an essential role in preparing the next generation for a 21st century workforce. We have a moral and ethical obligation to prepare our young people with the skills, abilities, knowledge, and aptitude to enter into a workforce in a world that we're leaving behind for them, one that looks a lot different from the one that we grew up in. So some of the big things to come out of the climate summit were the increased NDC ambitions. There's an acceleration of returning next year with improved NDCs. There's a sense of urgency, just even coming into Glasgow, a sense of urgency, a focus on ambition, action, and accountability. Forests took center stage. They've been recognized as a tool to solve the climate crisis. For National Wildlife Federation, who looks at habitat and ecosystems and wildlife as core to our mission, this was really an important advancement. And then the new rules for markets. We work with countries like Brazil about double counting and climate funding. So climate financing was a big theme of the week. And then this was the Nature COP. It was known as COP26, the Nature COP. So really focused on wildlife, nature, and ecosystems. And you can see that the climate finance pieces, 137 countries agreed to end deforestation by 2030 and committed billions of dollars in private public financing. One of the things that was quite notable about this COP was the private public partnerships that were being developed globally and at the domestic level and at the local level. I saw a question in the chat asking about subnational and more of the community-based pieces, and the private public financing is a big piece of that. The increased support for the Lowering Emissions by Accelerating Forest Finance Coalition to halt tropical deforestation. And then the UK government has an ambitious plan to align, track, and measure impact of all commitments. And as you all know, the UK government has a presidency this year and until Egypt next year. So this was the focus of my time at COP. What did COP26 mean for young people? There were increased protests, lots of people taking to the streets, activists, artists, innovators, indigenous peoples, disenfranchised communities, disenfranchised voices that really were arguing for a seat at the table. There's a social movement that's taking place globally that we're at NWF are trying to figure out how we tap into this social movement, how we build on the energy of the social movement, but really how we give young people agency to make decisions and to be part of co-creating their own future and being prepared for a 21st century workforce. We used to use terms like empowering young people, but we've been reminded that they already have power. And so really what we need to be looking at is how do we give them the tools that they need to give them the agency that they deserve to be able to have a seat at the table and be part of the decision-making that is going to impact so much of their future. This is the blue zone. There's the blue zone, the green zone, and then the streets. And so the blue zone is where all of the negotiations take place. These are where all the side events are, the pavilions, the plenaries. This is where the World Leaders Summit takes place. And we spent quite a bit of time there and then moved over to the green zone where a lot of dialogue is taking place and is more action oriented. At the top of this presentation, I described the ambitions. This is where those are decided in the political spaces in the blue zone. And then there's the actions that are really debated, and there's a lot of dialogue between NGOs and the private sector and individuals who have access to the green zone to talk about what those action items are and what impact it has on their communities. And then walking out into the streets, that's where you're seeing the protests and the, really call for action, the urgency, the frustration, the demands, you know, really the time is now, really people just being really, really frustrated. And I would describe the mood for the second week as being optimistic, but skeptical. People are optimistic, but they're demanding action and accountability and really want to see it to believe it, and not just taking it at you know, not just taking the commitments at their face value, but really seeing how that materializes. And then what made this COP so different, I've alluded to this already, are the Indigenous voices that were present this time at COP. The protests were louder, and then the finance that was committed. There were a lot of discussions around a just transition to a new economy, to a green economy, not leaving people behind, especially in developing countries and communities where they depend on fossil fuels or resources, and looking at a just transition. And Representative Boyle pointed that out earlier as well. There were conversations about how Build Back Better and Justice 40 plays into that, really focusing on our environmental justice communities and those transitions. And then public-private partnerships were kind of the theme of the day, as lots of different global leaders across multiple sectors, from banking to technology, basically every sector was represented and looking to establish some sort of collaboration around taking action. I would say the big thing is that it's impressive of how much progress happened in 2 weeks, considering this is a consensus-based approach. And so it was quite impressive that we were able to get the agreements in place that we did. But the work doesn't start there and the work doesn't stop there. So what we're looking at is, what does it look like between now and when we meet in Egypt? And the work that was supposed to get done over the next 5 years has really been accelerated to take place over the next year, as scientists are really looking at that 1.5 degree Celsius mark as the goal that we need to have in terms of our ambitions. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be happening over the next year. And this is an all hands on deck approach. So it's policymakers, it's private industry, NGOs, youth, Indigenous. It's an all hands on deck approach. So I think what we realized was that policy, regulation, policy and regulation just isn't going to be enough. There really is a social movement, a culture shift that is taking place, and we need to figure out a way to tap into that energy and to accelerate this movement, because leaving COP, you really felt like there's that sense of urgency that we need to act now or it'll be too late. And so not a whole lot of time to figure this out through policy alone. And then just leaving, everywhere you looked, it was the world is watching, whether people were holding up signs or their posters or media ads. That sense of desperation, urgency, and particularly with COP being in Egypt next year, this idea that it was in the UK this year, and maybe the impact of climate isn't as, it's not at that critical moment for a lot of communities, but certainly in some of our poorest nations and poorest communities, the impact of climate on environmental health, on flooding, sea level rise, devastating storms and hurricanes, and loss of life and property has been happening for many years. And so there isn't really time to wait and figure it out for many of those communities. So looking forward to Egypt next year, we met with an African delegation and some partners we're working with on some global education projects. They're really looking at that just transition, environmental justice, and climate reparation. And that was another theme, is just how do we finance adaptation, but also climate reparation for those countries that are producing the least amount of greenhouse gases are really at the ground zero for the impacts of climate.
Kim, thank you very, very much for a wonderful summary of not only your experience, but what you saw on each of those particular areas, whether in the green zone and outside on the streets. Those are particularly very valuable, I think, for all of us who couldn't be there, wanted to be there, but couldn't be there. So we really appreciate that. Again, we'll come back. There's a great question I want to ask you that came up in the chat here, and I want to come back to in a few seconds. But lastly, but surely not least, let me introduce our final panelist today, and that's one of Pennsylvania's greatest environmental champions, Mayor Bill Peduto of Pittsburgh. Mayor Peduto served on Pittsburgh City Council from 2002 to 2014 before being elected to mayor in 2014. And he has made Pittsburgh one of our model environmental aware cities throughout the entire country. And just this week, following Mayor Peduto's participation in Glasgow, Scotland, the Department of City Planning, Sustainability and Resilience Division finalized its city energy strategy. So I hope we can talk a little bit about that coming up here in a few minutes as well. So welcome, Mayor Peduto, and tell us what you believe are some of the most important results that you saw coming out of the COP conference.
Thanks, Stephen, and thank you for the invitation as well. My role was a little bit different in that we have been, and when I say we, mayors around the country and around the world have been working on a different dimension in trying to address the climate crisis. It began a few years before the Paris Agreement, and in understanding that even though nations would be creating treaties, the implementation of many of these plans would come down to cities and regions in being able to implement the change that is needed. We know that by 2050, that 75% of the world's population will be living in cities and regions, but as we sit here today, that 75% of the carbon being created that is captured in greenhouse gases is being produced in cities and the regions that they call home. And if we're really going to be able to reduce those by 2030 by 50%, it's going to be necessary for cities to come up with the ways to be able to do it. And it's not going to be through one cookie cutter type approach being done at a global national level, but it's going to be done through sub-national type of diplomacy where regions are working through community-based solutions that utilize the assets that they have on a local basis to be able to reach those goals by 2030. The clock is ticking. We don't have much time, and we need to be able to utilize the NGOs, the institutions, the corporations, the buildings, the transit networks, all of the different assets that are in our cities and our regions to be able to make that 50% goal happen. So I was part of really 3 different delegations that were a part of the discussions happening both in the green and in the blue zones. The first of which I serve on the national board, and that is ICLEI. ICLEI is a global organization working on environmental issues based out of Bonn, Germany, but with organizations and cities throughout the world that works on a local basis. The second organization where I serve on the global board and represent North America is an organization called the Global Covenant of Mayors. We have 11 board members representing all of the continents of the world. We have over 11,000 cities represented on this. And the Global Covenant of Mayors is strictly looking at the environment and the climate crisis and the issues that come with it: migrants, refugees, and the issues that are tangential to it, and being able to come up with solutions that are based on subnational policies to be able to address it. And the third was the first time that we had a delegation from Pittsburgh that was a part of COP. This was the first time that leaders from the Green Building Alliance and other organizations, and from our own planning department's Bureau of Resilience and Sustainability, were a part of the COP discussions as well. We're a part of working through that international dialogue of cities, regions, corporations, institutions, NGOs, to be able to have that dialogue at the subnational level. And we were heard. There was a lot of discussions that happened in the past COPs that I have been a part of. There was always sort of like the COP day for cities. And if you ever saw the movie, oh, what the heck was the name of the movie? Caddyshack, when they had the caddy day at the swimming pool. And they had like 3 hours where all the caddies just, you know, had their 3 hours at the country club. That's what it sort of was like for the cities. But both during the first week and the second week, cities and the other local subnationals were a part of a continuing dialogue of what are the ideas that are coming out of Manchester? What are the ideas that are coming out of Barcelona? What are the ideas that are coming out of Buenos Aires? What are the ideas that are coming out of Pittsburgh? And people sharing these ideas throughout 2 weeks, and awards being given for the best ideas that are coming from all over the world. And those ideas being shared not only by cities, but again, through the corporations, through the universities, through other large institutions, through the NGOs, and through others, that have sort of changed this idea of COP from just a top-down approach of nations to one that is starting to look at the 2030 clock ticking very quickly, and what we can do in order to be able to have all of these different approaches to be able to get us to that 50% reduction by 2030. With Build Back Better coming up, and I hope the congressman is right and it gets passed this week. What an incredible time to now start to look at all of these ideas across the United States, ideas that have been promoted by organizations like PennFuture, and to see the opportunities to actually put into place the financing that becomes a partnership between these different organizations. It's not going to be one big check like Publishers Clearinghouse coming from Washington, and all of a sudden, boom, your project's going to be done. But it's that partnership that comes together between local, between pension funds of unions, between the ability of having private equity of an organization that's been around, between having that ability to being able to pull in a university or somebody else. We put it together in a regional approach that we call the Marshall Plan for Middle America, and it received international recognition during COP26. And we believe now with Build Back Better, there will be a vehicle in Washington that will help West Virginia, help Ohio, help Western Pennsylvania, and help Northern Kentucky to be competitive in a world where otherwise we would have been left behind, and help us to be able to make the transition to renewable energy, where we will actually be able to lead and be able to create jobs and not lose jobs. And we have an economic development strategy to help get us there.
That's fantastic. And again, you know, your experiences over the past several years in terms of working with the environmental community in doing exactly what you're proposing here to bring us forward at the local level, to make sure that this transition that has to happen is going to be carried out with private equity and with local equity in ways in which, again, hopefully the Build Back Better bill will be the vehicle to inspire so much of what we can get accomplished. Let me, in our last remaining 10 minutes here, let me see if I can get a couple questions out here that I know have come through in the chat a little bit here. And I'm addressing them to both of you, both you and Kim. Kim, I know you've been involved for years, obviously now, of educating young people about the threats to the environment. And what message should we now be conveying to the millions of young climate activists who have taken to the streets to express their desire to see action in a more, can we say, see more action and less blah, 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 as some have put it?
Yeah, I mean, I really think it's giving them ways to have a seat at the table, really giving them the agency to voice their concerns and be part of the solutions. I don't think we do a good job. We call it, on my team, we call it sorry about your bad luck. We teach them about it. We tell them what all the impacts are. They're feeling it already. And then we basically walk away from the conversation. We need to continue to engage them, give them the tools that they need to have their voices heard. And so we've been building out student advisory committees, youth advisory boards, making them part of governance structures when decisions are being made, making them part of the solutions. And we need to elevate their voices, because whether we like it or not, they're going to be the decision makers 10 or 15 or 20 years from now, working on solutions that we probably won't have ready for them. And so we have a moral and ethical obligation to include them in those plans for solutions now, so they can be prepared for that 21st century workforce in a world that is much, much different than what we grew up in. So I think it's giving them all of those opportunities to be heard, and also to really acknowledge that they have some really great ideas that are more innovative and really think outside the box, and then to pair them with those private sector, NGO, and federal and state and local agencies, and have a seat at the table where it's more than just performative, but it really is taking into consideration really important voices that are currently missing from the conversation.
Thank you. And Bill, again, you know, at the local level here, we've seen in Pennsylvania, surely in the past year, we've seen all kinds of extreme weather situations that have developed, obviously, in Pittsburgh and flooding in Pittsburgh. And I know I've had tornadoes just within a mile of my own house here that are very, very unusual, to say the least. What is it, you know, what do you see as the way in which we can alleviate some of these, or let's say mitigate some of the impacts that are happening at the local community level, or city level, if you will, or community level here in Pennsylvania? What steps should we be taking?
Well, I don't think that we're going to be able to mitigate it. And in fact, if you look at the RAND report that came out about 2 years ago, when looking at our work that we're doing to work on our combined sewer overflow problems, they basically say that we aren't addressing it well enough, considering the impact of climate change, that the impacts of heavy rainfall will actually be much worse than what we're estimating. But what we can be able to do, and what we're investing heavily in, and what I'm hopeful the next administration will continue, is we're going to need to be able to have a fee that will be placed upon stormwater. You know, we have in Pittsburgh just massive parking lots that pay absolutely nothing. They don't have a spigot, you know, for acres and acres of land. Yet all that water goes into like a funnel into the system, and they utilize the entire system, but they pay nothing for it. And yet we have people who have grass yards who minimal amount of water goes into it, and they have to pay because they have water that goes into their house. We have to have a more fair and equitable system of being able to pay, and then that money needs to be utilized 100% into being able to create a green system of being able to mitigate and not being used to pay for gray infrastructure, but to be able to create a green solution where the system is more like a sponge than a funnel, where the water that comes into the system in the city of Pittsburgh is held and not put into that system. That will check many boxes. That will end flooding. That will end backups within people's basements. That will end the need for additional gray systems that will end up into the river with raw sewage. That will be able to help to mitigate the additional heavy rainfalls that we're going to see over the next 50 to 100 years. And that will give us better drinking water. So the idea is create a better revenue system around stormwater, and then utilize those additional funds to create a better environmental structure around how we retain stormwater and not simply ship it to a place where it gets processed.
Again, thank you very, very much for that. Again, that's one of the concerns I think we all have, not only in Pennsylvania, but as we move forward, that's critical. Let me ask you just both real quickly here. We only have a few seconds left. If there's one thought you want to suggest coming out of the COP conference, what would it be as a hopeful sign for all of us as we look forward here now to moving toward Thanksgiving?
So what I would say is, you know, I've had the wonderful experience of working for the city of Pittsburgh for 30 years. And as I transition out of government and politics, I intend to stay involved as I have in environmental organizations and as a citizen. I would suggest to everybody to stay involved. The one question, especially to young people that came up earlier, and I couldn't agree more with what Kim said, we tend to scare the hell out of them. We tend to give them this message of doom and gloom, and then we just stop. And of course they're going to say, fix it tomorrow. And we do the same with the other side. We tell the people in the surrounding counties around Allegheny, you know, if we do this stuff and we take coal away, there's not going to be a home for you anymore in Connellsville. Your kids won't have a job. You'll be forced to work at McDonald's and everything else. And then we just stop. We've got to give people a creative outlet. We've got to tell those kids that you have the opportunity to come up with a solution. You have the opportunity to be able to be a part of building something much better. And it's not simply like a light switch. It's your mind, and what you're going to be able to do is going to be able to solve this problem. We've got to tell the people who've spent multiple generations working in the mines and working in the mills and working in the factories that your family's built this country once, and we're going to count on you to build this country again. You want to turn a coal miner into an environmentalist? Put a paycheck in her hand.
How true. How true. All right, Kim, final word. You got 10 seconds.
I could not say it better, but my hope is in the young people. There's passion, there's energy, there's commitment. My hope is with the young people that are going to be coming to this conversation. And I think we need to focus on the transition, the just transition. And that's a global theme, but we need to focus on how people transition into a new economy and into the world that we envision.
Thank you both so much, really, for your insights today. I think we couldn't have had 4 better panelists today. And again, I want to thank you all very, very much. And I also want to thank Travis DiNicola and Jairus Stonesifer of PennFuture staff for, again, putting this together today. It has been a marvelous time. And again, I think as we look forward to the Thanksgiving holiday coming up, we do have some hopeful signs. And I think we have a lot of work to do. And so we want to move forward, and we want to make sure we thank all of you who have participated today for your support of PennFuture. And again, your financial support makes this all possible. And so we look forward to future broadcasts of this kind going on. So again, thanks everybody for being with us today. And again, hope to see you all soon.